Hello everyone. This week on Moser Makes, I'm going to show you how I made this workbench. But first, let me show you some of its features. The workbench incorporates both my table saw and miter saw. The center insert can be removed and the miter saw placed here. With the miter saw moved out of the way, there's plenty of table saw outfeed for long rip cuts. I added a grid of bench dog holes to the top. These serve many purposes. The most useful is for clamping things down. Specialty clamps can be bought for this, but at the end I'll show you a small hack for modifying cheaper F-style clamps to fit through the holes. The workbench is roughly 2 foot wide and 7 foot long, including the table saw. While a wider work surface would be nice, I kept it this size so that I could have room to move around it and work when there is a car parked on the other side of the garage. Now for the construction. I started by planing down some 2x4s. I wanted to remove the rounded edges for a cleaner look. After this, I cut all the pieces that will form the top frame of the bench. Here's how all these pieces fit together. I used number 9 2.5-inch screws to join all these together. I took my time to clamp and carefully line up each piece before driving in the screws. This will form the top of the workbench, so try and get it as square and level as possible. The 2x4s I started from were a little twisted, so I got everything as close as I could, but not perfect. Next, I used a pull saw to cut out this section, which will create the opening where the miter saw sits. After this, I moved the frame back inside, then wrestled with a sheet of 3/4-inch plywood. I used the track saw to break down the piece of plywood, cutting out the piece that will be the top of the workbench. Next, I marked the area to be cut out for the miter saw. I first traced the edge of the frame and then added a 1/2-inch offset to create a lip for the cutout to rest on. Then, I cut out the straight sections with the track saw and used the pull saw to finish the cut in the corners. Finally, I used a chisel to clean up the corners. After this, I sat the frame onto the top and used clamps to get everything squared up. Then, I flipped the whole thing right side up and marked out a reference line for adding screws. I first pre-drilled holes and then used 1.5-inch finish head screws to attach the top. The finish head screws are easy to sink into the plywood. I made sure all the screws were about 1/4 inch below the surface to prevent them from catching on materials or nicking blades if I make a cut on top of the workbench. The next thing I needed to do was cut out a piece of plywood the exact size of the void in the frame for the miter saw. Once it was cut, I did a test fit. I wanted it snug and it came out just right. Time to get Mr. Craig out and drill pocket holes into the 3 sides of this board that connect to the frame. In order for the platform of my miter saw to sit flush with the top of the workbench, I need this piece to sit flush with the bottom of these 2x4s. That's because the platform of my saw is 3.5 inches tall, in other words, the exact width of a 2x4. This height might vary with different saws. Now onto the table saw mount. My plan for this required some modification to the saw. On each side of the saw, I drilled and tapped 2 holes that could accept a 1/4-20 bolt. Then I marked the location of these holes onto 2 blocks of wood. I drilled holes for the bolts and used a Forstner bit to create a recess for the bolt head. These blocks bolt onto the saw and allow it to rest on the rails extending from the bench top. Next, I needed to cut down the rails so that the top of the saw will sit flush with the top of the workbench. I marked out a cut line for this, flipped the bench onto its side, and cut these out. Again, I'm using the combination of the track saw and a pull saw to make the cut. The height of the saw came out pretty close, but the saw had a bit of a wobble. Eyeballing it from the side made it pretty apparent that the 2 rails weren't parallel. This may have been due to a crooked cut, but I think it had more to do with a bow in the 2x4. I cut a shim piece from the offcut, which brought it up to level. Then, I glued the shim and stop blocks into place. After this, I turned my attention to the legs of the workbench. This next step could be skipped, but I opted to cut down the 2x4s to remove the rounded edges and create a slightly thinner piece of stock. I tried a different method this time using the table saw instead of the planer. These are the pieces that stack up to form the leg assembly, and I'll use glue and brad nails to join it all together. I clamped 2 boards along the edge of my workbench. I butted the boards up against these to make sure they were square before nailing them together. The brad nails basically just act as clamps to hold the boards together until the glue dries. The real strength of this assembly comes from the glue, not the brads. With the legs assembled, I clamped each into place. Next, I added a stretcher between the legs at the bottom for additional strength and stability. Then, I used screws to secure the legs to the top of the bench. I used 2.5-inch washer head screws for this. I got them snug, but didn't overdrive them into the wood. I want to be able to easily remove these screws if I need to disassemble and move this bench to another space in the future. Woohoo! The workbench is together and decently sturdy. The table saw extension creates a bit of a cantilever that can cause the bench to tip if you aren't careful and put too much weight over the saw. Fine for this workbench, but probably something to modify in a future design. I added casters for ease of moving the bench around the garage. If you haven't tried this style of flip-up workbench casters, I really recommend them. They work really well and are easy to operate with just your foot. I'll leave a link in the video description to the set I used along with some other useful stuff. I worked on this bench over the course of 3 days, which was actually a bit longer than I thought it would take to build, but I seem to always underestimate this. The last step was to lay out this grid and drill the bench dog holes. I first drilled a small pilot hole and then followed that up with a 3/4-inch Forstner bit. This Forstner bit leaves a really clean cut on the top surface, and I didn't worry about chip out on the underside. Lastly, let's modify a couple clamps so that the 2 sections can come apart and the clamp can fit through the benchtop holes. To do this, you just need to grind off the tab or bump at the bottom of the bar that prevents the moving section of the clamp from being able to slide off the end. An angle grinder with a grinding wheel makes quick work of this, but a hand file could also be used. I found that the spring assembly of these clamps likes to fall apart if you tilt them the wrong way once they're off the bar. They're easy to put back together, but I guess this is where it would pay off to buy specialty clamps. These will work for now though. There you have it. I'm stoked on the bench and stoked to be able to use my table saw and miter saw without bending down to the ground. I also really like the size of the workbench. While a bigger workbench and a dedicated miter saw station would be nice, for a small workshop setup, I really like this solution. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, everyone.